Thank you, Mr. President. We recognize Senator Dom for explanation of House amendments to Senate Bill 1212.
Senator Dom, you're recognized for the presentation of the House amendments to Senate Bill 1212.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Floor Leader, members, this is what has been referred to as constitutional carry. We have heard about this substantially over the last few days, especially, and the few hours. What this would allow is for those citizens of the state of Oklahoma aged 21 and up, or military veterans ages 18 and up, to be able to carry a firearm without having to go through the current licensing process that we require for a concealed carry weapons permit. This does not do away with the permitting process. People would still have that as an option, so they could have that for reciprocity. This just says that if you are not prohibited from purchasing or possessing a firearm, if you are a law-abiding citizen, you would be able to have that firearm just as you currently do under the licensing provisions. This does not change or impact any areas where you are currently prohibited, such as on elementary school grounds, colleges, universities, any government buildings where they are doing business with the general public. It does not change any of those things. That stays in effect. So what this, like I said, does is just removes the licensing requirement for those who would choose not to do that for law-abiding citizens age 21 and up. With that, Mr. President, I will yield for questions and move adoption of the House amendments at the appropriate time.
Members, that concludes explanation of the House amendments. Any questions on the amendments? Senator Matthews for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, have you talked to very many law enforcement agencies about your bill?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Yes, there have been various conversations with law enforcement agencies and individual law enforcement personnel.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Senator, based on those conversations and just the possibility of this bill passing, do you feel like this bill will be safe for law enforcement officers?
Yes, I do.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Then, just to satisfy my curiosity, am I to understand that anybody would be able to carry without having a license? Is that correct?
No, sir, that is not correct. Mr. President, it would only be those who are legally capable and able of purchasing or possessing a firearm, so not just anyone.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so how do we tell the difference of who's legal and who's not if everybody's carrying them?
Thank you for that question, Mr. President. The same way that we currently do is that if somebody is carrying, law enforcement can go up and ask them to identify themselves, so it's the same way that it currently is done under the current process.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so am I to understand that law enforcement would just look at certain people and decide to randomly check people to see if they have not even a license, because now they won't have to have a license. What will they do? Look at their license and run a check on people randomly? How would that work?
Yes, they would. Individuals would be required to identify themselves to law enforcement, as is currently the process. But rather than running a check on the concealed carry weapons permit, they could run a check based on their driver's license or other form of identification.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so if 20 people are carrying firearms and an officer comes across them, maybe 4 of them shouldn't have them. They may be felons that may not be able to carry a weapon currently or have committed a crime that causes them not to be able to carry a weapon, and the other 16 could. So am I to understand that the officer is supposed to look at each individual and check everybody's license every day, all the time, until they find out who is legal and who's not?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. This doesn't change the current process for that, for how law enforcement would identify if somebody is legally carrying or not. This just eliminates that licensing requirement.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so, Senator, if this bill passes, first of all, I'm curious as to how you feel that officers are more safe, police officers are more safe by this bill.
Thank you for that question, Mr. President. Again, this doesn't change the process for that. People still have to identify themselves to the law enforcement personnel, so this doesn't change that process.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, Senator, is there a possibility that law enforcement may just look to see if people look like they may or may not be legal and subjectively ask for a license, or do they do that with every single person that has a firearm?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Law enforcement can currently do that subjectively, if that's what you're asking. This does not change that.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, you may not know, I did get trained. I did go take training, and I came from a public safety background. I'm a CPR instructor. I believe people need to be certified to do CPR. I believe that the training that I received was supposed to be safety training. And so, is it your belief that we don't need that anymore?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. No, I believe people should get the training. I believe people should be trained and equipped in whatever they are doing, but especially with firearms. I believe that people should have that training, yes.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, I may not be understanding clearly. So people get the training for free, or people just get the training for free, and is there a fiscal impact if that's the case for that training?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. Sorry, allow me to clarify. I believe that people should be trained, but there would not be a requirement for training for them to be able to exercise their constitutionally protected Second Amendment right.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, unlike driving a vehicle where people do have to get a license, are you saying that some people can choose to go get trained safely, and some people can just pick up a firearm, put the bullets in it, no matter what caliber, with no training at all, and just we trust because they have the right to have it, that we wait until something happens to find out that no training could be dangerous?
Thank you for that question, Mr. President. Yes, there are differences between the Second Amendment, the right that is enshrined in the Second Amendment in the Constitution, and driving a vehicle. There are some differences in that with the licensure process. We do not require a background check, to my knowledge, to get your driver's license. So that is one of the differences. And in the Constitution, we do not have spelled out that the right to drive a vehicle shall not be infringed. So I would say there are some differences between those two.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. I agree that we have the right to bear arms. My question, again, is whether or not it is prudent for us to have people get lethal weapons like this with no training at all. That is my question.
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. As with all of the Bill of Rights, the rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, we do not require that they go through training for those different rights. We do not require that they go through a background to exercise those rights.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And how many states have already passed this bill, Senator?
12 states, Mr. President. Similar legislation, not this exact bill.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. This exact bill, has it been passed in any other state?
Thank you for that question, Mr. President. No, every state drafts legislation differently. That's why I clarified not in this exact language, but there are 12 states that have passed what is called constitutional carry legislation.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, is there going to be, in your opinion, is there any impact to those organizations, those local gun dealers that give classes currently for people like me that took a class? Have you checked with them to see, or have you looked at the possible fiscal impact to those gun dealers and those ranges that give the certification that's currently required?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. As previously stated, we are not doing away with the licensing provision. We are doing away with it being a requirement. It is still a provision, and in the states that have done similar things to this, we have seen that people have continued to renew their concealed carry weapons permits for the sake of reciprocity. We've also seen people continue to go through the process and do the classes, do the training, and get their initial concealed carry weapons permit so that they could have that reciprocity. So we have continued to see that. It's been a negligible difference. It does fluctuate every year anyways, so it's hard to actually prove if it was based on this or not because it's been such a negligible difference.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, would you believe that law enforcement officers have asked me not to support this bill? Would you believe that?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. I believe that some might have done that, but I know that there have been some that have contacted me in support of it.
Follow up? Nope. Additional questions? Senator Brooks for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. So you mentioned before, if someone was encountered in the street, then would a person have to be a suspect in a crime before the officer could detain that person and be able to run the proper databases to see whether or not they're legally authorized to be able to carry a firearm?
They would have to identify themselves to the law enforcement officer if the law enforcement officer approaches them on the street, just as they currently have to.
Follow up?
But after that, if an officer chose to investigate fully, or additionally, after gaining the identity of the person, because just knowing the person's identity will not indicate whether or not they're legally able to carry a firearm or not. Is that correct?
Correct, but the law enforcement officer is legally allowed to ask them if they are a felon or if they are legally permitted to have that firearm.
Follow up, Senator
Follow up.
Brooks.
Thank you very much. Would they be legally authorized to be able to detain them?
If they believe that they are committing a crime, yes.
Follow up, Senator Brooks.
So how long would the appropriate time be to detain that person?
Just like with any other detainment suspicion, it would be the same with this. If they believe that they are committing a crime, there's set laws and case law based on that. So this doesn't change that in any way, one shape or another. It would fall back to that existing law of how long an officer could detain someone under suspicion.
Follow up, Senator Brooks.
And so what databases would a law enforcement officer use to be able to check to see if someone's legally able to carry a firearm?
Thank you for the question. They could run it through their databases to see if the person is guilty of assault and battery, if the individual is guilty of stalking, if the person is guilty of a violation of the Uniform Controlled Dangerous Substance Act, any of the databases that they would normally run somebody through if they had suspicions of them being guilty of a crime.
Follow up, Senator Brooks.
Thank you, sir. In addition to that, there's also provisions for illegal immigrants and whether or not they would be able to carry firearms. Would that also be available in that law enforcement database? Because I don't believe that it would.
Thank you for the question. I believe that there are ways that law enforcement can access the ICE databases and other databases to determine if someone has been and has entered the country illegally, been detained, been returned to their country of origin, and then come back here. The reason that language is in this bill is because that is a requirement of federal law.
Follow up, Senator Brooks.
Thank you. Are you aware of what the databases are called or how they work?
Thank you for the question. Are you staying specifically on the immigration stuff or on all the different databases?
Senator Brooks, to clarify your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you. On all of those, on all of the disqualifications to being able to possess a firearm.
I'm sorry, was the question on the disqualifications for the firearm?
Right. On the disqualifications to be able to carry a firearm.
Yes.
And so, are you aware of the names of the databases or which ones exist and how that would work? And how an officer would be able to do that if he encountered someone in the street?
Yes, there are existing provisions for that. 12 other states already do this. There is ways that they can have access to federal databases to see if the person is guilty of any of the federal laws that would require this, and they have their own databases, local and state databases that they could connect into and see if the person is guilty of any of these provisions that would preclude them from having or possessing or owning a firearm.
Follow up, Senator Brooks.
And so at this point, you would put the burden on the police officers, and they would have to go through this analysis to be able to determine whether or not someone's able to legally carry or not while they're in the field. Is that correct?
Thank you for the question. Under existing law, it's the same way. The law enforcement officer has to determine if the person is legally carrying a firearm or not. Just the fact that you are carrying a firearm is not suspicion of any guilt or any wrongdoing. So just the fact that somebody has a firearm isn't suspicion or guilt.
Follow up, Senator Brooks.
Is there currently a database based on permits that they can check one database to be able to find this rather than having to access multiple databases and do the analysis in their brain?
It is the OSBI database that keeps the record of those, and that would be one of the same databases that they could check to see for anybody in the state that is prohibited from having a firearm, and that also connects with some of the federal databases as well.
Follow up, Senator Brooks.
And so rather than being able to have to access one database and do that analysis, they would have to go through multiple databases, and that citizen would be detained during that time. Is that correct?
If they believe that the citizen is violating some crime and they want to verify, yes, the law enforcement officer could go through the databases to check and see, because what this would do is it would allow people their constitutionally protected Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms. So yes, the onus would be on the law enforcement officer if they were checking to see if somebody's Second Amendment rights should be violated or revoked for one of these preclusions.
Follow up, Senator Brooks.
Thank you. Has there been a fiscal impact on this, on the lost licensure fees to the state of Oklahoma?
There has been an estimate that has been made by OSBI, yes.
Follow up.
Can you tell me what it was?
Yes, it was around $4 million.
Follow up. Nope. Additional question. Senator Dossett for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know the author made himself available beforehand, but I've had some questions pop up in this line of questioning. Can the author tell me how many licenses, concealed carry permits are issued every year in the state of Oklahoma? Do we have that information?
I requested that from OSBI. I did not get the exact number. I do have the revenue generated from each one each year. So in fiscal year 14, it was $5.2 million. In fiscal year 15, it was $6.4. In fiscal year 16, it was 7.1. In fiscal year 17, it was 5.1. And in fiscal year 18, they were saying 4.4. So as you can see, it has fluctuated over the years by millions of dollars. There is no necessarily consistency with it. And in the other states that have implemented this, they have seen a minimal drop because, like I said, people still continue to get the permit for out-of-state travel for reciprocity.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's where my next question was headed. In these 12, or I think it was 12 states, you said, is every one of them, is it consistent, though, there's going to be a drop in license issued after this kind of legislation passes?
In those states that have done this, it has consistently been a minimal drop, even within like 1% to 2%. It still stayed in the 90% mark, or even 97, 98, the high 90s of those that have continued to get those permits.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. But it is going to be pretty much a guarantee that the local businesses in my district, in my communities, will see a drop in the amount of people that will be after this license. Understanding that people will use it for reciprocity and they will renew it, but there will be a drop from the general public in desiring this. Can I safely say that, in your opinion?
I wouldn't be able to say that I can guarantee that, no. As you originally stated, I don't say that we can guarantee that. I still think that people should get training. I still think people would get training. I think the market would find other solutions for that to offer training without the requirement of the license. So I don't foresee a major drop in that, no.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. On a different line of questioning, this legislation does restrict certain people. Can you basically give me a breakdown on who this restricts from having this ability?
Yes, give me 1 second to turn to the page, if you don't mind. It is anyone that would be carrying the firearm in furtherance of a crime, anyone who is guilty in this state or any other state of assault and battery, aggravated assault and battery that qualifies as domestic abuse, stalking, violation of an order issued under the Protection from Domestic Abuse Act, a violation relating to illegal drugs under the Uniform Controlled Dangerous Substance Act, or anyone that is prohibited in any other way from possessing or purchasing a firearm.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. So on the restriction side of things, I keep hearing over and over when we talk about this bill that the Second Amendment is our natural right. It's our right to have firearms, to bear arms, to protect ourselves, protect our families. Why are we restricting so many people who may have moved on, may not be a problem anymore? Is it necessary to restrict, to make these restrictions if this is a right that we all have?
If they are currently under those restrictions, they would, under that adjudication, they would be guilty of that, and they would not be able to continue to carry this. There is a provision that we have in existing statute that if they have received a pardon for that, they would get those rights restored.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. So but isn't this restrictive? Is this not restricting people who are free in the public to protect themselves from potential threats?
I would say that this would actually expand people in the public being able to protect themselves from potential threats.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. But we are restricting some people from protecting themselves by passing this measure tonight. Is that correct?
Thanks for the question. People that are currently prohibited under state or federal law from purchasing or possessing a firearm, they are already prohibited from having the firearm under state or federal law. We aren't changing that. We're just saying since they're already prohibited from possessing or purchasing the firearm, they also cannot carry the firearm. If they can't purchase it, if they can't possess it, it stands to reason that they shouldn't be able to carry one either, something that they are legally prohibited from possessing or purchasing.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. But the push on this bill is that we are giving inanimate rights to Americans to defend themselves. Why aren't we just removing all restrictions? If that is our goal here, is to allow people to protect themselves, why are we restricting anyone from having a firearm?
There are current restrictions in state and federal law. There are restrictions in federal law that would apply here on the state level as well. Those are things that would have to be changed if we want to restore that at some point in time, but that doesn't start in this chamber. That would have to start in Washington, D.C. if we want to change those federal laws. Until that point in time, we comply with those federal laws until they are changed. If that's something that you would like to advocate for or other members in this chamber would advocate for, that's something that could be addressed, but that's not what this bill addresses or deals with.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. This should be my last one. Was that ever part of the conversation to remove all restrictions by the state of Oklahoma? I'm not aware of all the federal guidelines that we're trying to fall in line with here. But the state of Oklahoma, we've been pretty clear we do what we want with our legislation. So was that ever part of the conversation? Is that something that do you support, removing all these restrictions as well?
That has not been a part of the conversations in this legislation.
Senator Matthews for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, correct me if I don't have the correct version of this bill, but I'm looking at page 14, line 9. And it talks about a traffic violation. And it talks about transporting a loaded pistol in the motor vehicle without a valid handgun license. And it states just above that that's improper transportation of firearms. Can you explain that?
Mr. President, page 14, line 9, that is existing law.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so, are we striking that because I don't see a strike through there, or is it your belief that once this bill passes, then that portion would be invalid.
Thank you, Mr. President. If you look at the lines 10 through 12, where the new language is underlined, it would say, or in violation of any law relating to the carrying or transporting of firearms. So that adds to it. This is just dealing with the citation aspect of it. If someone is illegally carrying or improper transporting of the firearm, so this just deals with the citation aspect of it.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. The word "or," in the way I understand it, is if this or this happens. And so this says that a person is improperly transporting a firearm if they're in a vehicle without a valid handgun license. That is written there, and usually when it's invalidated, it's stricken through. Why is that not the case here?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. As I previously stated, it said, or in violation of any law relating to the carrying or transporting of firearms. Because we are expanding this law to cover people being able to carry, that expands that by adding that underlying language.
Follow up, Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. On page 3, it talks about, Senator, on page 3, it talks about assault and battery. Is that one of the things that if a person has committed assault and battery, that they would not be able to carry a firearm? Is that true?
That's correct.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so if that's true, then when a person is going to they're in the park and they're carrying, and the sheriff comes up to them, and they want to know if they're legally carrying a firearm. So are they going to be looking at all of their police records after they look at their license to find out if they've ever been charged of assault and battery? And what if an individual is being charged with it but not found guilty? What would happen in that case?
Right now, if you look on page 3, line 13, it says any person convicted.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And so, follow that line of thinking, then am I to understand that every person, and if this is true, then every person that's not restricted, which could be hundreds of thousands of people in our state that are not currently licensed, could be carrying firearms. When they're stopped on a traffic stop and they're carrying, is the officer going to have to look at their full background to find out if they've committed any of these things, rather than to look at a license that says that they can carry, to find out if they're meeting this law or not?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. We have a long tradition and history in this country of believing people that they are innocent until proven guilty. So if law enforcement does believe someone is guilty of this, then that would be up to the discretion of the law enforcement officer, just as it currently is when they see somebody carrying, for the law enforcement officer to determine if they want to go and check that person out.
Senator Rader for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, were you aware at one time in this country that some people had to pay to vote?
Yes, Mr. President. I believe that was called a poll tax.
Follow up.
Thank you. Mr. President, you think that was fair?
No, I don't, and we actually did away with that.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, some have said there's a correlation between a poll tax and payment of fee to own a gun. Would the author hold that similar view?
I would agree, yes.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will a background check still be required in this law?
For the purchase of the firearm, yes.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Of the 7 surrounding states, how many are reciprocal if this law is passed?
We have reciprocity with all of them. There are 3 states surrounding us, immediately touching us, that have constitutional carry as well.
Follow up.
For those states that do not have a similar law, will an Oklahoman be able to just cross state lines without adhering to their laws? How does that work?
No, when you cross state lines, you do have to adhere to their laws. That's why we have reciprocity laws. So this bill only affects law-abiding citizens here in the state of Oklahoma. While they are in the state of Oklahoma, we actually currently, with our reciprocity laws, those other states that have constitutional carry, we respect their laws through reciprocity. So there are citizens of other states that actually have more rights than Oklahomans do currently because we respect their laws.
Follow up.
I guess what I'm asking is, what if an Oklahoman goes to their state? Is an Oklahoman now, will that Oklahoman have to be registered then? Will that Oklahoman be required training?
It's a case-by-case situation. Some states don't have any reciprocity at all. So even with our current concealed carry weapons permitting, if you have that, those states do not recognize that. And if you try to carry with that the current process, they would not recognize it. So it is a case-by-case basis.
Follow up.
Back to Oklahoma, will private owners be able to set their own rules?
Yes, whether they are businesses, whether they are renting a venue, whether it is a private property owner in their home or residence, this would still protect all private property rights.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, does that include public places like Chesapeake Arena, Owen Stadium, Lewis Field?
Correct. Yes, it does. The one exception, which is in current law, this is current law, is that if you have a firearm in a locked vehicle in a parking structure, because the courts have ruled that your vehicle is an extension of your home with your castle doctrine. That's your property, not their property. As long as you keep it in the vehicle and do not exit the vehicle, you're fine. But if you exit the vehicle, then it is up to the private property owner to make those determinations.
Follow up.
Thank you for the follow-up, Mr. President. Just at the chance of being redundant, movie theaters, churches, supermarkets, shopping malls, they can all set their own rules. This law will not supersede those owners' rights. Is that correct?
That is correct. Whoever has either the ownership or is in charge of the property, they would still be able to set whatever policy they want.
Follow up.
One more. Thank you for the follow-up, Mr. President. Earlier I asked about the tie between 1212 and 1608. Why does that requirement not bother you that it's not included in there, that 1212 cannot be implemented unless 1608 is signed?
The reasoning for that, for cleaning that up, and 1608 had the same language that 1212 has currently. When they were working with law enforcement, some law enforcement were okay with it saying issued, some were not. So we wanted to change it back to the existing law to say approved. The reason that we have a special designation for law enforcement is because even when they are off duty in plain clothes, they can go on duty at any given time. So we want to make sure that their liability is limited if they are carrying a personal firearm when they are out and about off duty, but then they have to respond to a crime. So that's why we're trying to clean up that language to make sure that they have their liability protected.
Additional questions? Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, have you talked to our presidents of our higher ed institutions about this bill and whether or not they support it?
I have not. This bill does not impact them, so I have not talked with them.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for that answer. Senator, would you believe that a president of one of our universities has asked me to make sure that I don't support this bill? Would you believe that?
I have heard similar things, but I would point out that no presidents of any universities have come to me at all with any concerns on this, which I find strange since I am the author on this bill. And not only no presidents, no one from any higher ed institution or universities have come to me to express their concerns with this legislation.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And maybe I didn't hear you clearly, Senator. First, I thought you said that this had nothing to do with universities, and No, you had not heard from them. And then I thought I just heard you say that you had heard similar things to my statement that I'd heard from a president. Which is true? Which is true?
I have not heard directly from any presidents or universities. I have heard from other members that they were reached out to by university presidents and others, but I have not heard directly from them, even though I am the primary author on this bill.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. So it is true that you have heard that there are concerns from presidents of universities about this bill.
I have asked for anyone to provide me with specifics on their concerns. No one has been able to provide any specifics on any concerns. Just making a vague statement that you have concerns, I believe, is unfounded.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator, do you believe that not only the students of our great universities in our state, but many visitors show up on our college campuses every day? And do you believe that it would be difficult for security on those campuses rather than for a person to just show a license to do what you stated earlier? Is every person that visits to make sure that our young women and young men on our college campuses are safe from harm from individuals that don't have to carry? Do you believe that, or don't you agree that there will have to be extensive checking of everyone that goes onto a college campus to check their full background just to visit a college campus if they're carrying? And not only that, but don't you believe that the expedited process of just showing a license is a lot less difficult than what we would face if we passed this bill on our college campuses?
Thank you for the question, Mr. President. We do not currently allow for concealed or open carry on campuses, with the minor exception, unless it is approved by the university president. That is such a small number of people that it is usually just a handful of people, and the university presidents usually notify the campus police that is responsible for that of who those individuals are. So that is such a small and minute number that, again, this bill is not impacting at all, that no, I do not believe that this will make a major change in any way, shape, or form.
For a follow-up question, Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. Whether or not the individuals are actually allowed on campus, when people don't have to have a license, don't you agree that many more young people, those that are not troublemakers as well as possible troublemakers that come to these college towns, do a lot of drinking of alcohol and those kinds of things, and don't have to be responsible enough to get a license, don't you agree that that could be unsafe?
Thank you for the question. This legislation does not address that on college campuses. That same concern that the gentleman from Tulsa has expressed could exist under the current system that we have.
Follow up, Senator Matthews.
Thank you, Mr. President. Don't you agree, sir? Don't you agree, Senator, that currently, if anyone is carrying a weapon, all they have to do is pull out a license, and that makes it simpler for an officer or anybody else to realize who is legally carrying a weapon. Don't you agree that that's true?
I would say that in America you are innocent until proven guilty. With no other of our constitutional rights do we require a background check and the payment of a fee in order to exercise that right.
Senator Yen for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe we've been referring to this as the constitutional carry. Could the author please remind me when the Constitution was written?
It was written in the late 1700s.
Follow up, Senator Yan.
Thank you, Mr. President. And in the late 1700s, did everyone carry a handgun or a weapon or some firearm?
Not everyone, but a vast majority of the population, yes.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Did women and children carry firearms? I realize you weren't alive back then, but did women and children carry firearms?
On occasion, yes.
Follow up.
And is it not true that back then, in the late 1700s, perhaps there was a greater need for a firearm? Is that true?
I wouldn't necessarily say that there was a greater need back then versus now. And the Second Amendment isn't about a need, it's about a right to self-defense.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let's say I were driving down I-35 in my car and I didn't have a license plate on it. And let's say a state trooper, a very by-the-book state trooper, decided to pull me over because I didn't have a tag in my car. And he asked me for my insurance verification, and I didn't have one. And he asked me for a bill of sale for the vehicle that I'm driving, and I didn't have one. He could ticket me, certainly, for those violations. And let's say I had a weapon on my person, and let's say I had this concealed handgun permit on me. He could not arrest me, correct?
Under current law, if you are not violating other statutes, you cannot be disarmed, or the firearm cannot be taken away from you or arrested if you are not committing any crimes that aren't worthy of arrest.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And if this bill, Senate Bill 1212, passes, and I do not own one of these concealed handgun permits, then the trooper also could not arrest me. Is that correct?
If you are not violating any laws, they cannot arrest you. That is correct.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, would it surprise you to know that 23 years ago, last month, this is what exactly happened? And the driver of the vehicle, which had no tag, the driver had no insurance verification, the driver had no bill of sale, but the driver did have a weapon on his person. And this very by-the-book state trooper arrested this man and put him in jail 23 years ago, last month. Mr. President, do you know that story?
Yes, I am very familiar with that story. The law enforcement officer saw the gun on the individual, and the law enforcement officer asked the individual. I'm very familiar with the story, as I don't know if everybody here is tracking where you're going with this, but yes, I am familiar with the story.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And what was the name of that individual?
Timothy McVeigh.
Follow up. Senator Duggar for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank the floor leader. I want to go back a little bit to some of the former comments that were made by the good Senator Matthews a minute ago and talk about colleges and educations. Do you know that the college and universities, regents and presidents have consistently stated in a public forum that they have a no guns on policy enforced provision? in every one of them?
Yes, I'm aware that the regents and others have a no-guns policy.
Follow up.
So wouldn't it be possible that you were actually aware that they had that policy?
This bill in no way impacts higher institutions of higher education, so I'm not sure where you're going with that.
Senator Duggar for a follow-up question.
Thank you. I'll try to get more specific. We'll go to page 5 of the bill itself. And on page 5, it said in the amendment number 8 that after the word as and up to, that is on line 17, and going to line 18, to the word license shall be eliminated, and a statement added that says to be college, university, or technology center school property. And I want to point out on here that there is only one word as. License is never mentioned on line 18, and so I'm having a little problem in following where this would actually be effective.
Thank you. Allow me to clarify. Those amendments that you're referencing are to the engrossed House Senate Bill 1212. So you need to go to the very back, and you need to go on page 5 of the engrossed House bill to be able to identify what portion of it is addressing, not page 5 of the amendments, page 5 of the engrossed House bill. Excuse me, Senate bill.
Follow up, Senator Duggar.
Thank you. I'll do that, and then we'll go back to questions. Thank you.
Additional questions? Senator Sparks for a question.
For the presenter, something you said caught my attention. You said that of our rights, under the Bill of Rights, and others are protected under the Constitution, that we didn't have to pay a fee or get a permit to exercise our rights. But in the First Amendment, the right to peacefully assemble, many jurisdictions do require permits to peaceably assemble, do they not? And license.
I believe I said we don't require any background checks and fees. I'm not aware if we do require background checks to peaceably assemble.
Follow it.
I mean, the record may prove me wrong, but I believe you said no other right requires a fee or a license. Maybe I'm wrong. Assuming I'm right, though, that's at least one I've found in the last few minutes. The right to trial by jury is also protected under the Constitution, yet if we file lawsuits, if we ask for trial by jury, we also have to pay a fee, do we not?
Yes, and as I previously stated, I'm very confident that I was clear about the background check and the fee, because this same line of questioning was brought up over on the House side, and in doing my due diligence, I presumed that someone would also bring up the same line of questioning. So a lot of my concern with this is the background check, which the fee covers.
Follow up.
But to be certain, just the mere existence of a fee or a license for an orderly regulation of a right that's otherwise guaranteed by the Constitution is not a per se violation of the Constitution. Would you agree?
I would also point out that the Second Amendment is the one amendment that says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There are those that would believe that having to pay that fee would be an infringement. I do not believe that that shall not be infringed language is also used on the right to trial by jury or to petition the government. I may be incorrect in that, but I believe that is the only instance where that terminology is used.
Follow up.
Well, indeed. In the Seventh Amendment, it says the right of trial by jury shall be preserved. I would suspect that for purposes of our discussions here this evening, whether they're preserved or not infringed is a distinction without a difference. Would you agree?
Well, and I would also suggest that we, in many ways, with our Indigent Defense Fund and other ways, we do preserve that right to that trial.
Follow up. Okay. Additional questions? Senator Eichley Freeman for a question. Senator Eckley Freeman should be using Senator Matthews' mic.
I apologize. Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to start off by stating how much I appreciate the efforts in being available for questions in the 20 to 30 minutes between the updated agenda and this bill being on the floor. Unfortunately, we ran out of time to explore many of the questions that I had, and I'm not going to ask the question about the data that I asked for because I assume you didn't have time to finish looking that up. But I do need some clarification on a few things. We were talking about in verifying whether or not somebody is basically meeting any of the prohibitions on carrying firearms, and you talked about, or the author talked about utilizing just law enforcement to look that up in the databases through the person carrying a driver's license or some other form of ID. In the bill, do we make any contingencies that to carry the firearm you must carry a form of ID on you with all times?
You do have to identify yourself to law enforcement personnel, yes.
Follow up.
But do we make any contingency that they must have a formal ID?
Under current statute, yes, law enforcement can ask for identification.
Follow up.
Do we require the person carrying the gun to have an ID to present to the officer?
Yes, under current law, that is a requirement. Not only do you have to have your concealed carry weapons permit, you have to have your additional form of identification, like your driver's license.
Follow up.
And additionally, in the law officer looking up and verifying those things, you discussed many of the different avenues that an officer would have to go through in order to verify those things. About how long is that going to take?
I can't say how long that would take, but again, that would be on the law enforcement officer because in America we are presumed innocent until proven guilty.
Follow up.
You mentioned checking with ICE on whether or not their immigration status was legal or not. Do you have a guess as to how long that takes?
I do not.
Follow up.
Do you know how long it takes currently for law enforcement to verify whether or not somebody is in possession of a firearm legally?
I don't have the exact time, the statistics on how long that would take. I would presume it would take however long it takes them to walk back to their vehicle and run the person's name through the database.
Follow up.
Would it not take as long as it takes for the person to provide their current concealed carry permit?
It could take the same amount of time. It could take more time. It could take less time.
Follow up.
So, if I'm understanding this correctly, we're talking about changing a time frame from maybe 20 minutes on the higher end to verify these things with the concealed carry permit to hours, days to verify immigration status and legal right to that firearm?
If the law enforcement personnel were to operate in that way, they could operate with that, yes, and they could detain someone. We can't detain someone indefinitely. Each department has their regulations on detaining individuals. There's case law on that, on detaining individuals if they believe someone is guilty of a crime. If they do not believe somebody is guilty of a crime, they cannot continue to detain them.
Follow up.
And forgive me because I'm not regularly in the practice of law. What are those limits currently?
I don't have those before me right now, but again, in America, in our jurisprudence, we are considered innocent until proven guilty. So that would be the way that the officers should operate unless they do believe that there is a crime being committed.
Follow up.
So there is still the possibility that a individual who is legally entitled to this firearm could end up being detained for an undue amount of time until they run into the legal limits of amount of time that they can be detained in order for the officer to verify these things.
There's that possibility with any number of things under current law if the officer believes that they are violating a crime.
Follow up.
And I wanted to follow up lastly on the questions about transportation of a loaded firearm and the licensing reference. I heard earlier the author make comments as to whether or not they could legally carry it without a permit, and that the reference was mostly in relation to a citation. So are we saying that if you are carrying a firearm without the license, that you could be issued a citation still?
Correct. He was asking about that provision that deals with citations. So if somebody is guilty of violating these provisions, they still could receive a citation.
Follow up.
So if we have permitless carry and I get in a car with my gun, but I don't have a license for that gun, I can still be cited.
If you don't have your driver license?
To clarify, go ahead.
The concealed carry permit.
If you are violating other provisions of the proper transportation, yes, you could be cited.
Follow up.
Cited for having the gun?
Cited for the improper transportation of the gun.
Follow up.
So it is improper transportation of a gun, according to this bill, to not have a concealed carry permit and transport the gun in a motor vehicle.
No, that would not be the improper transportation of it, depending on the methodology for which it is transported.
Follow up.
I apologize because I'm not quite understanding how the license comes into play here, considering it's included in part of the whether or not someone will be cited. Can you explain that to me a little bit thoroughly?
Yes. So for instance, under existing law, current law, if you are carrying a rifle, it cannot be chamber loaded. So if you had the rifle chamber loaded, that would be something that you could be cited for, whether or not you have your concealed carry weapons permit. So that's existing law. So if you have your concealed carry weapons permit under existing law and you're carrying it chamber loaded, you could be cited for it. If under this new proposal, if you don't have your concealed carry weapons permit and you're not a felon, you're not in any other way prohibited from carrying a firearm, and you carry it in that improper manner or transport it in the vehicle in the improper manner, you would still be guilty of that potential citation.
Follow up.
But the bill says that if you don't have the concealed carry permit, then you are unlawfully transporting the weapon.
But in other provisions, it explains and defines what improper or proper carrying of the firearm in transporting in a vehicle is.
Follow up.
So we have conflicting sections of the bill?
No, because this references those sections. This says, or as otherwise in violation of any law.
Follow up.
That says or, not and. So technically they do conflict.
No, if you read it all in conjunction, it doesn't conflict with the improper transportation of a firearm.
Additional questions? Senator Yen for a question.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe the author told the good senator from Tulsa that no one from higher ed had spoken to him directly. Is that correct?
None of the university presidents reached out to me on this. I have heard from I have heard that others have had conversations with those from higher ed, and so, but nobody from the university presidents have reached out to me.
Follow up.
You said none of the university presidents have spoken to you. How about, has Jonathan Nichols from higher ed discussed this with you?
He has not discussed it with me. As we were walking out of caucus, he said he would send me some information, but I have not received any information from him.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. President. So Mr. Nichols did not tell you that he believed their legal team thinks that if this passes, it allows guns on campuses and knives in the classroom? You didn't get that information?
He said he would be providing me some information. He would text me the information, but I did not receive that information.
Follow up, Senator Yen.
Thank you, Mr. President. That is what Mr. Nichols says.
Additional questions? See no additional questions. Will there be debate on the House amendments? Senator Sharp for debate. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Mr. Floor Leader. It is wonderful to be a part of a deliberative body here as a legislator and a senator. I do not stand of which to convince any of you, and again, I will accept whatever the wisdom. There's clearly very bright minds here in this legislature, but I am considering the fact that this should be, as any deliberative body, policy over politics. And if this is policy over politics, then we should be asking two questions. Do you feel safe now? If you do not feel safe now, therefore we should enact Senate Bill 1212. Now, if you do not feel safe now, we need to ask, what is the problem? Is it a real problem, or is it really just a figment of your imagination? That's the question we have to ask. I am very supportive of the Second Amendment rights. But what is concerning to, and I have never, ever voted against a bill as a senator for the last 6 years that is contrary to those Second Amendment rights. But at the same point in time, I am concerned here that when we are talking about your Second Amendment rights, we are taking away all certification, we're taking away all background check, and we're saying it is your constitutional right to carry a gun without a permit, without any background check. This is the same, but the same argument, what would bother me, though, is the same argument that you would be making here, that you have that right of which to carry a gun without any type of background check or certification. The same individuals, I am convinced, would be making the assertion and the argument that before you vote, you must first present a voter registration card, or you should not have the right to vote here as a constitutional right in the United States of America, of which I would also agree with that. The very first thing that Wyatt Earp, one of my favorite cowboys and marshals, did is to control guns within the city limits of any community. The same thing was true as an American history student. That's one of the first things of which I found out that colonial American communities did. It is one of the first things that after the ratification of the Constitution and therefore later the ratification of the Bill of Rights, still your communities still control guns within their borders. We call this civilization. I am concerned about this legislation going forward as it is. I am concerned that this legislation creates more problems than it solves. Again, is that policy over politics when we are in fact creating a law, a statute, that is creating more problems than which it resolves? We keep coming up with more and more problems. There are problems with this legislation. We should think it through before we do so. But again, as I've said, I will respect the desires and the wishes of this body. And again, I do not always claim to be right, but I am concerned. I'm supposed to be speaking to a sports group next week of children. I'm to be speaking at some graduations. I want them to live in a safe environment. And does this legislation create a safe environment for our children and grandchildren in the decades to come in the state of Oklahoma? That's the question you need to ask. Thank you.
Senator Matthews for debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I know many of you, if not all of you, have already decided how you're going to vote on this bill, but I just need to say a few things about some of the comments made by Arthur. One of the comments was innocent until proven guilty. And one of my concerns is safety. I repeat all of the time that I have a safety background. And One of the police officers that told me that they didn't support this bill made me think about African Americans that have been killed because police officers were afraid that they had a gun, going to get a gun, going towards a gun. Mr. Philando Castile had a concealed carry license, told the officer that he had a gun and a license and was killed in front of his own daughter. I don't know why that happened. I don't know if it's because the officer felt afraid. I don't know if the officer thought that he was not supposed to have a gun and should be killed. I do know that if this bill passes, there will be a lot more individuals that don't have licenses, that do come upon police officers, some of which the author has already agreed don't believe that this bill should pass. And I'm concerned about those individuals. I'm also concerned that college presidents, and we just had educators from across the state here, while we all said that we support education. And they were mad because they had not been funded, and we partially funded them because they had to confront us. The author has said he has heard. I have told you that I've heard directly from a president of a university in the state. You've all heard that, but do we care what they think? Do they have to storm the Capitol?
You can't hear?
We know that although I may not have voted for some of these bills that have come through that are so-called gun laws or Second Amendment laws, but the laws that we have, I support the laws that we have, and one of them is that people get certified and get trained to carry a gun today. And although Philando Castile, with that training, lost his life in front of his daughter, I still think people need to get that training. I don't think that we ought to put more people in that situation and more officers in that situation and more people afraid of other people because they can't do a background check instantly on every single person. And I think we ought to listen to our presidents of our universities that are trying to protect our children getting an education. And so, for those reasons, I'm voting on that bill, and I want you to consider the things that I've just spoken of.
Additional debate. Senator Yen for debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't know about the rest of you all, but my office has been inundated by constituents that are opposed to this bill. And obviously, the world today, the United States today, is drastically different from what it was in the late 1700s. Perhaps in the late 1700s, everybody did need to have a firearm. Some women, some children. But we don't live in the late 1700s anymore, do we? And I think it's not very much to ask that if a person is going to be carrying a weapon, that they have some sort of training. I do have a concealed handgun permit, and I thought it was pretty good training. And I was one of the first ones to get that. I got it in 1995, right after the bill was passed, and if I remember right, the author of that was Senator Frank Sheridan. who just last night told me to be adamantly against Senate Bill 1212. He said, kill that bill. The person who authored the concealed handgun permit law. I also want to stress that if we had passed Senate Bill 1212 before 1995, when the Murrah bombing occurred, Timothy McVeigh would not have been arrested. I encourage everyone to vote no on Senate Bill 1212. And, Mr. President, I'd like to make a motion to sine die.
That motion's out of order. Senator Floyd for debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, you know, every session we get close to sine die, and we all talk about the process and some of the issues we have with the process, and we express our concerns about the way the process is going because we're getting close to sine die and things are really picking up speed. When this bill left us to go over to the House, it was 8 pages long. It was 8 pages long, and it had 5 words that were amending current law. 5 words: wildlife refuge, wildlife management area. That was it. This bill comes back to us a few days before sine die. It's 28 pages long, and it is marking a major policy change in Oklahoma by eliminating the requirements that Oklahoma residents obtain a permit before carrying a loaded handgun. This type of major policy change shouldn't be made at 10:45 in the evening, a few days before sine die. We have not properly vetted this change. This amendment is going to severely limit the right of business and property owners. We haven't discussed that to the extent it needs to be discussed. It's going to severely limit their rights to implement safeguards regarding how guns are carried onto their businesses. You know, a few years ago, we had a similar bill appear before us, and it dealt with possible damages that we were going to have for event property owners who hosted events. It was not properly vetted, and it made it to the governor's desk before we realized that these property owners, that these event hosts, were going to be severely limited in being able to conduct their business because of a law we were about to pass. The cities and the state as a whole were going to lose sporting events and concert events because the owners were not going to be able to limit and oversee what kind of guns and weapons could be brought into their events. We were at risk of losing some sporting events, some concerts. The fiscal impact couldn't even be calculated because they weren't sure what we were going to lose if that bill was signed into law. We're looking at a similar situation here. The only fiscal impact that we know for sure is the fiscal impact we have from the staff, which tells us that according to OSBI and SDA license trends over the past several years, this measure would cause OSBI to have a significant decrease in annual revenue. OSBI estimates that they would have an 80% decrease in their SDA revenue, which would result in an estimated $4.2 to $4.8 million annual revenue decrease. And OSBI has indicated that will lead to a decrease in personnel. Members, there is too many unanswered questions. Not even speaking to many of the questions that were asked about just the safety factor. This bill, this concept has not been properly vetted, and I would ask that you please vote no.
Further debate. Senator Silk for debate.
Mr. President, members, I'll be very brief. I just want to make a couple points. One, when we talk about the decrease in revenue to the OSBI, the licensing fees actually go to operate the licensing system. So if there is a decrease, that's okay, because it just means that they're not going to be needing that revenue to operate the licensing system. Although I don't believe there will be a huge decrease, because other states who have done this have not seen it. But just a little bit of real-world reality of where Oklahoma's at that I like to give an example. I have my concealed carry license. I always have a firearm on me. We always carry them in all of our vehicles. My wife, we've got 7 kids. They're all young. We homeschool them all. So my wife stays very, very busy. And it's hard for her to carve out time to go get this license and this permit. She's very proficient with a firearm. We shoot at our property quite a bit. But when we keep a firearm in our vehicle, and she drops me off at a store and say she runs over to get gas, right now in the state of Oklahoma, she would be in violation of the law. It's our car, it's our property, it's our family, it's our safety. But just because she can't carve out the time and go through all the hassle to get a fee or get a license, she would be in violation of the law. This bill would address that. And I think a lot of Oklahomans are in need of that and will appreciate that. And I encourage you to vote yes.
Additional debate. Senator Dom to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, members, for the opportunity to bring this before you all, for the opportunity to engage in this civil discourse, to engage in this deliberative body in the way that we have tonight. I know it is late. I know that we still have other work to get done, but I appreciate the time and effort that not just myself but others have put into this. I appreciate the questions, even if we might disagree on this topic. I think for those of you that know me, know that my main focus is on the Constitution, on securing and protecting our rights, our God-given constitutionally protected rights. This is one of those rights. This Second Amendment right is enshrined in our Constitution. Yes, it was written many, many years ago, but the Constitution has gone through many changes since then. There have been other amendments. There have been other things that have been proposed. There's been good changes made to the Constitution. But the Second Amendment has not changed since that time. It still says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We do not require for any of the other rights in the Bill of Rights or the Constitution that the people have to preemptively go through a background check. They have to preemptively go through a background check, pay a fee, go through licensing, get fingerprinted, go through training in order to exercise that right. We don't require that for them to exercise their freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. We do not require those rights for them to be secure in their person's effects. We do not require that they go through that process. It is time that Oklahoma reinstates our God-given constitutionally protected rights. 12 other states already have this, meaning that citizens of those 12 states have more rights when they come to the state of Oklahoma than the people of the state of Oklahoma currently have. I believe in the people of Oklahoma. We are a good people. I trust the people of the state of Oklahoma. Yes, on occasion we may have some bad actors, but that doesn't mean that we should presume that everyone in the state of Oklahoma is guilty until they prove their innocence. That's un-American, and that's certainly not the spirit of Oklahoma. I ask you and encourage you to vote yes to restore the rights of Oklahoma citizens. Thank you for your time.
Members, that concludes debate on the House amendments. A roll call has been requested. If you're in favor of adopting the House amendments, you will vote aye. If you're opposed, you will vote nay. Clerk will open the roll. Those wishing to vote or change your vote. Senator Bias, Senator Brooks, Senator Dossett, Senator Brown, Senator Fields, Senator Griffin, Senator Yeck, Senator Kidd, Senator McCourtney, Senator Peterson, Senator Pemberton, Senator Pugh, Senator Racino, Senator Shaw. Yes, sure. Yeah. Those wishing to vote or change their vote, chair is preparing to close. Senator Bice, Senator Dossett, Senator Fields, Senator Griffin, Senator Yuck, Senator McCourtney, Senator Pemberton, Senator Pugh, Senator Racino, Senator Shaw. Chair is preparing to close. Senator Racino, do you care to vote? Senator McCourtney. Close the roll. Senate Bill 1212, having received 32, the House amendments to Senate Bill 1212, having received 32 ayes, 11 nays, I declare the amendments to be adopted. Members, Senate Bill 1212 is now before you on fourth reading and final passage. Will there be debate? Seeing no debate, the vote will now occur. If you favor the measure, vote aye. Opposed, the measure, vote nay. Clerk will open the roll. Senator Sykes presiding.
Are there members wishing to vote or change their vote? Senator Stanislawski presiding.
Those wishing to vote or change their vote, chair is preparing to close. Okay. Go ahead. Those wishing to vote or change their vote. Senator Pittman, do you care to vote? Senator Pittman. No. Close roll. Senate Bill 1212 having received 33 ayes and 9 nays, I declare the same to have passed.